I want to tell you about the bead string first, because that's where it really starts. Not with the woman dying in my doorway, not with the auditors and their writs, not with what happened on the 43rd night. It starts with a loop of 22 clay beads on a knotted cord, each bead no bigger than my thumbnail, each one fired in a slightly different color of ochre or cream, or the pale green-gray the Kethani call kiveth. The color of old river water, if your river ran through limestone hills under a sky with two moons. I didn't know what the bead string was the first time I saw it. I thought it was a child's toy. I was wrong, and that wrongness set everything that came after. My name is Marin Solis. I spent 31 years coordinating logistics for the Outer Boundary Relief Consortium, supply manifests, temperature-controlled shipments, cross-species nutritional requirements, the particular misery of filing transit corridor customs declarations for 17 categories of humanitarian cargo. I am good at paperwork. I am good at waiting. I am good, in the particular way that 31 years of watching bureaucracies operate teaches you to be good, at understanding what a system actually wants versus what it says it wants. What a system says it wants is compliance. What a system actually wants, 9 times out of 10, is to not be embarrassed in front of a superior authority. That knowledge kept a child alive. I want to be clear about that before I tell you anything else. Not a weapon, not a clever scheme, not some dramatic act of physical courage. I am 54 years old and I have bad knees, and I run the kitchens at a refugee way station on a moon most charts don't bother to name properly. The only thing I had was 31 years of knowing how systems work. It was enough, barely, but it was enough. Way Station Sarath 6 sits in the transit corridor between the Kethani homeworld system and the resettlement zones further rimward. The Kethani call it the passage of leaving, which tells you something about the Kethani. They name their sorrows cleanly, without softening them. About 11,000 displaced persons were living in Sarath 6 when I arrived to take over the kitchen operations. By the time the reclamancy's auditors showed up, we had closer to 14,000, because the political situation spinward had deteriorated in the way that political situations in that part of the galaxy have a tendency to do, and the transit corridor checkpoints had slowed to a crawl, and people were waiting. They were always waiting. The station had been an ore processing facility before the consortium retrofitted it. High ceilings, corrugated metal walls that hummed in the ventilation current. The smell of industrial solvent underneath the smell of cooking, always, no matter how many times we scrubbed the floors. I had a kitchen staff of 1912 Kethani, 4 humans from the consortium's field crews, 2 Vethali who had wandered in from the resettlement queue and never quite wandered out again, and a former merchant fleet cook named Joss who had no species I'd ever been able to pin down, and who made the best flatbread in 3 systems when he was in the mood to bother. We fed 14,000 people twice a day. That was what I was doing on the evening the woman died. Her name was Esaveth, though I didn't know it then. I learned it later from the mortality registers, which the Kethani community kept with extraordinary precision even here, even in this repurposed ore processor on a moon with a gravity that made your ankles ache. She had been in the resettlement queue for 11 months. She had a respiratory condition that the station's medical staff had been managing as best they could, which was not as well as any of us wanted. She came to my kitchen door in the dinner rush. I remember the sound before I turned, a particular kind of knock, not urgent but deliberate, the knock of someone using the last of what they had to make the knock and no more. I turned from the stove where I was monitoring the protein pulse ratio on a vat of Kethani stock. The Kethani have a specific mineral requirement in their diet that humans don't, and getting the balance wrong causes a miserable kind of low-grade vertigo that lasts 3 days, and I saw Esaveth in the doorway. She was holding a child. The child was small, pale violet skin, silver hair that floated slightly in the ventilation current, the way Kethani hair does when it's very fine and the child is very young. Eyes the color of amber caught in light, wide and very still, fixed on me with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that being still is safer than movement. The bead string was wrapped twice around the child's left wrist, 22 clay beads on a knotted cord. Esavith said something in Kethani that my translator didn't catch cleanly, the acoustics of the doorway, or her voice too low, or the noise of the kitchen behind me. She pressed the child toward me. The child came forward 2 steps with the expression of someone who has been told this is necessary and has decided to trust the telling. Esavith said one word I did catch clearly, because she repeated it twice. Orinde. The child's name. Then Esavith sat down in my doorway and didn't get up again. I've thought about that moment many times since. I've tried to remember whether I made a decision in any conscious sense, whether I weighed the options, considered my responsibilities, thought about the forms I would need to file. I don't think I did any of that. I think I just stepped over Esavith's legs because the child had taken those 2 steps forward and was standing in my kitchen looking at me, and a child standing alone in a kitchen needs someone to look back at her. I crouched down to Orinde's level. She was waist-height on me, maybe a little less. Her eyes were dry. Whatever she had already been through in her short life, she had already learned not to cry where strangers could see. I said in the Kethani I had been learning haltingly for 2 years, "Are you hungry?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, very carefully, as though hunger were a thing you had to be careful about admitting. I brought her inside. I called the medical team for Esavith. Then I found a quiet corner of the kitchen near the warmth of the secondary stove burners, and I gave Orinde a bowl of the Kethani stock, which she held in both hands because the bowl was warm and she wanted the warmth before the food, and I watched her and tried to figure out what I had just taken responsibility for. The medical team was kind. The mortality team was efficient. The station administrator, a harried Vethali named Asek, came by the kitchen in the morning and told me that Esavith had been a solo registration, no family listed, no household, and that the child's status was therefore unresolved. I asked him what unresolved meant in practice. He told me it meant the child would need to be registered under a guardian's name within 14 days or transferred to the Kethani Community Oversight Board, which would apply its own protocols. I asked him what its own protocols looked like. He told me he wasn't sure, but he would find out, and that in the meantime the child was technically under my direct supervision because she was in my kitchen. I told him I understood. I didn't know then what the bead string meant. I noticed that Orinde never took it off. I noticed that she was careful about it in a way she wasn't careful about anything else, the way she held her wrist slightly away from surfaces, the way she tucked it under her sleeve when other people came near. Not hiding it exactly, protecting it. The first week, she slept on a cot in the kitchen storeroom because that was where she felt safest, close to the warmth, close to the sound of the burners in the next room. I don't know what she had been sleeping on before. I didn't ask. The Kethani I knew on my staff, Thurath, who managed the breakfast rotation, and old Suvesh, who had been a harbor pilot before the political situation had taken his harbor away. They treated Orinde with a particular careful gentleness that I noticed but didn't fully understand. They brought her extra portions of the protein paste that Kethani children specifically need. They spoke to her quietly and formally, as though being very courteous about something. I asked Thurath after about 4 days whether he knew whose child she was. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She is Esavith's daughter." But Esavith's registration listed no household. "Yes," he said, "that is correct. That is what the registration says." The way he said it told me that what the registration said and what was true were 2 different things, and that there was a reason for the gap, and that I would need to be patient before I understood it. I am patient. It is the most useful thing I am. By the end of the first week, Orinde had moved from the storeroom to a corner of the kitchen proper, behind the dry goods shelving, where she had constructed a small arrangement of boxes and folded emergency blankets into something that was halfway between a bed and a fortress. She came out to help with the breakfast prep each morning, standing on a crate to reach the counter, learning the rhythm of the work without being asked. She was very good with her hands. She was very quiet. She watched everything. I learned slowly the shape of her. She liked warmth and she liked repetitive tasks, and she did not like sudden loud sounds. She had no Kethani children to play with, because the family units on the station kept their children close and were cautious about the girl from the storeroom whose guardian status was unresolved. She didn't seem to mind. She had the kitchen, and she had the bead string, and she had me. I filed the guardianship registration on the 9th day. I listed myself as temporary custodial guardian under Consortium Humanitarian Field Worker Protocols, which gave me a legitimate administrative basis for the claim and a 60-day review window before any other party could contest. I had looked up the protocols very carefully. I had looked up several sets of protocols very carefully, because that is what you do when you have 31 years of watching bureaucracies operate, and you can feel something coming. I didn't know yet what was coming, but I could feel it. Asek, the station administrator, signed off on the registration without much argument. He was a good administrator in the sense of wanting problems resolved rather than perpetuated. A child with a guardian was a problem resolved. He stamped my form, kept a copy, and filed it in the transit corridor records system, which was accessible to any credentialed party. That was, as it turned out, the problem. I learned what the bead string was from Suvesh, the old harbor pilot, in the 3rd week. He came to me quietly during the post-dinner cleanup when the kitchen was nearly empty, and he sat down across from me at the prep table and folded his hands and told me in his careful, measured way what Orinde was carrying. The bead string was called a kiveth cord, 22 beads, each fired in a specific pattern of color that corresponded to a lineage, not a family in the simple sense, but a sacred bloodline vessel in the doctrine of the Kethani reclamancy, the religious legal authority that had governed the interior of Kethani culture for several hundred years. The kiveth cord marked its wearer as a lineal holder, a child born to carry a specific devotional lineage forward. In reclamancy doctrine, a lineal holder was not exactly a person in the ordinary legal sense. They were a vessel, a sacred trust, and the reclamancy's auditors, the enforcement arm of the faith, held full spiritual custody authority over any unregistered lineal holder. Unregistered meant not under reclamancy guardianship. My guardianship registration had been filed in the transit corridor records system, which was accessible to any credentialed party. The reclamancy was a credentialed party. "They will come," Suvesh said. He was very calm about it. He had the calm of an old man who has seen institutions do what institutions do for a very long time. "They will bring writs. Their writs are legal instruments under the Kethani Territorial Accord, which your consortium recognizes." "How long do we have?" "Esaveth kept the child hidden for 11 months in the queue," he said. "She knew what she was doing. She knew what the cord meant. She was the one who put it on the child, I think. A final claiming. The reclamancy does not move quickly, but they move. A month, perhaps 2. I looked at Orinde, who was in her corner, asleep with her wrist tucked to her chest, and the bead string hidden under her sleeve even in sleep. "What happens to her if they take her?" I asked. Suvesh was quiet for a long moment. "She becomes property of the faith," he said. "In doctrine, the lineal holder is consecrated. In practice, they are managed. They are not harmed in the physical sense, but they are not permitted to be ordinary. They are not permitted to be a child." I thought about Orinde on her crate reaching the counter. Orinde learning the knife work for flatbread prep. Orinde, who in the last week had started, very quietly, very tentatively, to hum while she worked, a sound like running water at low volume, the Kethani equivalent of being at peace in a familiar place. "All right," I said. "All right," Suvesh looked at me. I said, all right. It means I understand the situation. It means I'm thinking. He nodded slowly. You are human, he said, not as an insult, as an observation. Yes, I said. Esavith knew there were humans here, he said. It was why she walked to your door. She said she told me, 3 weeks before she died, that humans make decisions differently. That for a human, the child in front of them is always real, more real than the document about the child. I went back to my paperwork. I had a lot of it to do. The auditors arrived 6 weeks after my guardianship filing. There were 4 of them, 2 in the formal gray robes of the reclamancy civil arm, 2 in the dark, close-cut uniforms of the enforcement wing, with the silver tree-end cord emblem on their shoulders. They came through the main processing hall with a station escort, which they were entitled to under the territorial accord, and they went straight to OSEC's administrative office, which was also where they were supposed to go. They had 3 documents: a spiritual custody writ under Reclamancy Doctrine 44, which established their claim to any unregistered lineal holder; a transit corridor access permit granted under the Kethani Territorial Accord, which gave them legal standing to operate within the way station; and a demand for immediate transfer of the child registered under the name Orinde, lineal holder of the Kiveth Sarath devotional line, currently listed under the guardianship of one Marin Solis, consortium field worker, whose guardianship claim they were contesting on the grounds that a non-Kethani could not hold spiritual custody of a Kethani lineal holder. I read all 3 documents carefully in OSEC's office, while the auditors waited with the patience of people who believe the outcome is already decided. Then I told OSEC I would need 24 hours to respond. The lead auditor, I came to think of him as the gray, because that was the color of his robes and the color of his manner, told me that the reclamancy's writ took precedence over any administrative delay. I told him, very politely, that the consortium's humanitarian field protocols required that any challenge to a registered guardianship be reviewed by the station's welfare assessment officer before a transfer could be compelled, and that under the Transit Corridor Compact, no child transfer could be effected without that review, and that the welfare assessment officer was currently in the middle of an outbreak response in Sector 7 and would not be available until morning. This was true, I had checked. The Gray's expression didn't change. He said they would return in the morning. I spent that night reading. I read the Kethani Territorial Accord, which I had read before but not carefully enough. I read the Reclamancy's published doctrine on spiritual custody, which was available in translation through the consortium's cultural reference library. I read the Transit Corridor Compact's provisions on child welfare, which had been drafted by a human-led committee 20 years ago, and which contained, in Section 14, Paragraph 3, a clause about the mandatory consideration of a child's established living situation in any custody determination, a clause I strongly suspected the Reclamancy's auditors had not read, because it was buried in a subsection on agricultural labor disputes, and its application to custody cases was not exactly obvious. I made notes, I wrote a response brief, I made more notes. Orinde slept. She didn't know the auditors had come. I had told Thurath and Suvesh before leaving for OSEC's office, and they had managed the kitchen through the dinner service and kept things normal for her. When I came back, she was in her corner, and she looked at my face with those wide amber eyes. She had learned to read my face, the way children learn to read the weather, and I smiled at her and told her to sleep. She looked at me for a moment longer than usual. Then she tucked the bead string against her wrist and went asleep. I didn't sleep, I wrote. The welfare assessment officer was a Vethali named Kesara, who had been working transit corridor welfare cases for 12 years, and who had a reputation for thoroughness that made the station administrators nervous, and the consortium administrators quietly grateful. I went to her before the morning service, before the auditors came back, and I sat in her office, and I explained the situation and I gave her my notes. She read for a while. "The Section 14 clause," she said. "Yes. No one has ever applied it to a religious custody claim." "No," I said, "but the language doesn't exclude religious custody claims. It applies to any transfer of a child from an established living situation. Orinde has been in my kitchen for 6 weeks. She has an established living situation. The clause requires that the transfer authority demonstrate that the transfer serves the child's welfare and that no less disruptive alternative is available." Kesara looked at me. She was a small woman, precise in her movements, with the Vethali characteristic of very deliberate blinking that always made it look as though she were weighing every word twice. "You're not asking me to block the writ," she said. "I'm asking you to require the auditors to satisfy the welfare standard before a transfer can be compelled. That's your job. That's what the compact says your job is." "They will challenge it. They will escalate to Kethani territorial authority." "Yes," I said, "that will take time." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "The child is well." "Yes. She has adequate nutrition, appropriate living conditions, social integration. Her nutritional status is good. Her living conditions are appropriate. Social integration is developing." I paused. "She is learning to hum in the kitchen. I'm told that is a Kethani marker of contentment." Kesara blinked twice, which I had come to understand was the Vethali equivalent of a pause for thought. "I will conduct my assessment," she said. "I will need 3 days." The auditors did not like this. The Gray came to my kitchen that morning, which I had not expected, and stood in the doorway in his gray robes while I was supervising the breakfast service, and he told me that delaying the writ's execution was a violation of the reclamancy's legal standing, and that the consortium would be held accountable for the obstruction. I kept my attention on the protein pulse ratio for the morning stock. "The Welfare Assessment Officer is conducting a mandatory review under the Transit Corridor Compact," I said. "That review is not an obstruction. It is the process. If the reclamancy's writ is as unimpeachable as you believe it to be, the review will confirm that and the transfer will proceed. The review is a delay tactic." I looked at him then. He was maybe 10 years younger than me, and he had the absolute confidence of someone who has never been in a room where the institutions were not on his side. "The review is the law," I said. "The reclamancy operates within the Transit Corridor Compact. The compact requires the review. If the reclamancy objects to the compact's procedures, you are welcome to take that up with the Territorial Council. Their next session is scheduled for 8 weeks from now." He looked at me, the way people look at something they expected to move out of the way. "You are human," he said. "Yes," I said, "I am." "The child is not yours." "No," I said, "she's not. She is a child and she is in my care, and the process says she stays in my care until the process says otherwise. That's how it works." He left. I went back to the stock. Orinde had been in the dry goods corner, close enough to hear, far enough to pretend she hadn't. I didn't look at her. I didn't want her to feel watched. After a few minutes she came out and climbed up onto her crate and picked up the paring knife for the morning root vegetable prep, and I worked alongside her in silence for a while, and then she said, in the halting consortium standard she had been picking up from listening to the kitchen staff, "He wants me." Not a question. "Yes," I said. "To take me away." "He wants to, he doesn't get to yet." She was quiet cutting. The knife work was very precise. She had good hands. "My mother," she said. "She said there are people who think I belong to them." "Yes." "Do I?" I set down what I was doing. I turned to look at her properly. She was on the crate, which put her almost at my eye level, and her amber eyes were doing that thing they did where they were absolutely still and very serious, the look of someone asking a question they have been rehearsing for a long time. "No," I said. "You belong to yourself. That's true of every child and every adult in the galaxy, no matter what anyone's doctrine says about it. But they have papers. I have papers too, I said. The papers disagree, so we wait for someone to sort out which papers are right. She looked at me for a long moment. What if the wrong papers win? She asked. I thought about that. I could have told her it wouldn't happen. I'm not in the habit of lying to children. Then we find more papers, I said. She nodded once slowly, as though this were a serious and adequate answer. Then she went back to cutting. The welfare assessment took its 3 days. Cassara interviewed Oronde, gently, carefully, in a room I was not present for, with Thurath available as a Kethani cultural reference. She reviewed the kitchen logs, the nutrition records, the medical check-ins the station's health team had been doing as part of my guardianship registration. She wrote a 16-page report. The core finding was that Oronde was in a stable, appropriate care arrangement. That disruption of that arrangement would constitute a significant welfare harm, and that no assessment had been provided by the reclamancy, demonstrating that its proposed custody arrangement would meet or exceed the current welfare standard. This was not a denial. It was a requirement. The auditors had to demonstrate that life in reclamancy custody would be better for the child than what she had. I knew they couldn't do it. Reclamancy spiritual custody arrangements were not secret. There was literature on them, because the reclamancy published its own doctrinal materials. A lineal holder in reclamancy custody was educated in devotional practice, isolated from general society, and managed according to a schedule of ritual obligations that began in early childhood and continued for life. There was nothing in that literature about what a child preferred, or what made a child hum while cutting vegetables. The Grey filed an escalation to the Kethani Territorial Authority, as Cassara had predicted. The Kethani Territorial Authority's response time was, as I had known when I suggested it, 8 to 12 weeks. But the Grey didn't leave. He established a monitoring presence on the station, him and one of the enforcement wing auditors, because they were entitled to do that under the writ's provisions while the escalation was pending. They appeared in the corridors. They appeared near the kitchen. They watched Oronde with the patient, flat attention of people who are certain they are right and are willing to wait for the machinery to confirm it. Oronde knew they were there. She didn't show it mostly. She was very good at not showing things, but I noticed she had stopped humming. I noticed that, and I found it harder to be patient after that. The weeks settled into a particular kind of grinding wait. I had to be careful about the kitchen, careful about what I let any of us show. There was a school of thought. Among the legal advisors I was consulting via consortium relay, that any evidence of emotional distress in Oronde's living environment could be used by the reclamancy to argue that the current arrangement was itself causing harm. Which meant that the monitoring presence, the watching eyes in the corridor, the unspoken pressure of 2 auditors who appeared at the kitchen service window every morning at exactly the same time, all of that was potentially tactical, not just punitive. They were watching for the fracture. So we did not fracture. We ran the kitchen. We fed 14,000 people twice a day. The flatbread rotation, the morning stock, the protein pulse calibrations for 3 different species nutritional requirements. Joss taught Oronde how to get the pull right on the flatbread dough, which she practiced with the focused intensity she brought to everything new, not hurrying, not performing, just working at it until the muscle memory settled in. Thurath taught her the specific timing of the Kethani stock that made the difference between adequate and good, the moment when the mineral suspension reached the right saturation before you pulled the heat. She learned these things the way she had learned to trust me, carefully, over time, measuring against repeated experience. Old Suvesh sat with her in the evening sometimes, in the quiet after the dinner service when the kitchen was mostly clean and the burners turned low. He told her things in Kethani stories, old ones about harbor pilots and navigation by the twin moons. I don't know exactly what he told her because I couldn't follow Kethani well enough at that speed in those registers. I know she listened. I know that on the evenings when he sat with her, she slept more soundly afterward. There was an afternoon, 3 weeks into the monitoring period, when Orenday and I were working through the secondary VAT calibrations together. She had asked to help, not in the vague, wanting to be useful way some children have, but with a specific question about why the numbers kept running low in the morning and not the evening, which was a better question than most of my supply staff ever thought to ask. I showed her the calibration log and explained about thermal variance in the ore processor's converted cooling system, which was never designed for food-grade applications and which had particular behavior in the morning cycle when the station's climate management was running its overnight reset. She listened and then said, very precisely, that if the variance was predictable, you could adjust the morning baseline proactively rather than correcting after the fact. She was right. I started doing it the next day. I thought about that afterward, about what it meant to be 11 years old and already looking for the mechanism underneath the surface rather than just the surface problem. She had learned it from somewhere. From Esaveth, I supposed, from a mother who had spent 11 months navigating a transit queue while carrying a secret that could get her killed, making decisions 2 steps ahead of the people who wanted to find her, treating every system she moved through as something to be understood rather than simply endured. Some things are taught. Some things come the other way, from child to parent, from child to whoever is standing in the kitchen when the teaching starts. I had thought I was teaching Orenday about paperwork and patience. I was beginning to suspect she had been teaching me something too, about the kind of attention that doesn't stop at the obvious explanation. The Gray came to the service window twice a week during this period, never inside, always at the window, the same time, the same flat regard. He was watching for the fracture. I was sure of it by the 3rd week. The Gray understood systems too in his way. He understood that the pressure of being watched, of knowing that any sign of distress could be used against you, was its own kind of instrument. Apply it long enough and something would show. He was waiting for Orenday to break under it, or for me to make a mistake in my filings, or for the kitchen to become what he needed it to be, a site of harm rather than haven, a place that was damaging the child rather than sheltering her. What he got instead was flatbread lessons and calibration logs, and an 11-year-old who asked sharper questions than his junior auditors could manage. I don't know if he knew how close it sometimes was. On the bad nights, and there were bad nights, when the communications relay with the legal office gave back nothing useful, and the 60-day clock felt like it was running in the wrong direction, I would sit at my desk after the kitchen was quiet and try to find the thing I hadn't thought of yet. The clause I'd missed, the precedent that would close the gap, the argument that would make it unambiguous instead of just arguable. On those nights the Grays flat, certain patients felt less like arrogance and more like knowledge, like he could see an outcome I couldn't, and was simply waiting for me to arrive at it too. On those nights I would look at Orenday in her corner and remind myself, she is still here, she is still here. Whatever comes next, that is true right now, and right now is what I have to work with. It kept me working. That is what it is to be a human doing this kind of thing. You don't do it because you're certain of winning. You do it because the child is still there and the next filing is still possible and you are not done yet. I filed 3 additional documents during those weeks. A supplementary guardianship affidavit with supporting statements from Thurath, Suvesh, and Jas. A request for clarification from the consortium's humanitarian legal office on the interaction between spiritual custody writs and transit corridor welfare provisions. A request I worded carefully enough that the legal office couldn't simply route it to a form letter, because I had cited 3 specific cases they had been involved in and asked for their position on the precedent. A query to the Kethani Territorial Accords Civilian Oversight Committee about whether reclamancy writs applied in the same way to a child who had been residing outside Kethani territorial space at the time of the writ's filing. That last one was the important one. I didn't know the answer. I was asking genuinely. The accord had been written to govern the conduct of the reclamancy within Kethani space, and Way Station Sarath 6 was technically in the transit corridor, a shared jurisdiction zone. Whether the writ's full force applied in shared jurisdiction was, as far as I could tell, genuinely unresolved. The Territorial Accord's Civilian Oversight Committee had a 60-day response window. 60 more days. I was going to be honest with you. By the 40th day, I was not certain we were going to win. The territorial authorities' response to the escalation had come back, and it was complicated. They acknowledged the welfare assessment's findings. They acknowledged the jurisdictional question I had raised, but they had also confirmed that the reclamancy's writ was facially valid, and that absent a definitive ruling on the jurisdictional question, the transfer could be compelled once the Civilian Oversight Committee responded. The committee still had 20 more days on their window. 20 days might not be enough. I was thinking through what I had left, not much, procedurally. A formal objection filing with the consortium's humanitarian office, which would take time I might not have. A request for emergency interim relief from the Transit Corridor Compact's arbitration panel, which required a showing of imminent harm, which I could argue but not guarantee. I didn't sleep well that night. I went over the Doctrine 44 text again, looking for the thing I might have missed, the procedural gap I hadn't noticed. There is always something. I have learned that in 31 years of working with institutional systems. There is always a detail that the people who built the system forgot to check, because they were building it from inside their own assumptions, and their assumptions had blind spots. I just didn't know where the blind spot was. Not yet. On the 31st night, the gray came to my kitchen. Not in the morning, not at the service window, to the kitchen after hours, when the station corridor outside was quiet, and the dinner cleanup was done, and Orenday was asleep in her corner. He stood in the doorway in his gray robes, and he told me that I was causing harm, that the child's natural community was being denied to her, that whatever I thought I was doing, I was in fact keeping her from what she belonged to. I was washing down the main prep counter. I finished the pass I was on before I answered. She has a community, I said. It's 12 meters in that direction. It's a kitchen staff of 19 people who taught her the flatbread pull and the timing of the stock, and the reason the morning numbers run low. That's her community. She has a spiritual home, he said, a lineage, a people who have waited generations for the restoration of this bloodline's devotional cord. She hums, I said. He was silent. Or she did, I said, before your people appeared in the corridors. She hummed when she worked, low like running water. It is, I'm told, a Kethani marker of contentment. She stopped the day after your monitoring presence began. Children are accurate instruments. They measure what adults try to hide. He looked at me with the expression he had been using on me for weeks, the expression for things that should have moved and haven't. This ends one way, he said. It ends when the process ends, I said, not before. He left. I stood at the counter for a long time after, not cleaning, just standing in the kitchen with the ventilation current moving past me, looking at Orenday's corner. The bead string was on her wrist. I could see it from where I stood. Ochre and cream and Kiveth green, the same colors every night. I thought about Esiveth's knock. The sound of someone spending the last of what they had on a single action. I thought about what she had decided when she walked to my door, not just that I could help, but that a human would. That for a human, the child in front of them is always real. I went back to my desk. I filed another inquiry. And then I sat and looked at the Doctrine 44 text one more time, looking for the thing I hadn't found yet. 2 days later, I was sitting at my desk during the afternoon quiet, the window between the late lunch cleanup and the dinner prep when the kitchen was briefly still, when I heard Orenday on the other side of the dry goods shelving. She was moving something, shifting boxes, with the precise and deliberate sounds of someone rearranging their space. I didn't look. I let her be. After a little while the sound stopped. Then she came and sat on the edge of the prep table nearest my desk, which she did sometimes when she wanted to be near without being in the way. She sat with her feet dangling and her wrists in her lap, the way she sat when she was thinking seriously about something. I kept working on the supply manifests. The morning protein pulse numbers had been running fractionally low for 3 days, and I was trying to figure out whether it was a supply issue or a calibration drift in the secondary vat, and either way I needed the numbers to tell me which. After a few minutes she said, "They're going to keep watching." "Yes," I said. "Until something changes. Until something is resolved." She was quiet. Then, "Are we going to run out of something to file?" It was a sharp question. She had been paying attention to the shape of what I was doing even when I hadn't explained it explicitly. Children do that. They absorb the structure of adult preoccupations the way they absorb language, through proximity and repetition and the gradual recognition of patterns. "Not yet," I said. "But there's a limit." "There's always a limit," I said. "That's what I'm trying to find the edge of." She was quiet for a while longer. The ventilation current moved through the kitchen. The low-cycle hum of the secondary burner on standby was the steadiest sound in the room, the kitchen's own heartbeat. "Marin," she said. I looked up. She almost never used my name. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the difficulty." I set down what I was doing. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I said. "You didn't choose any of this. Your mother put a cord on your wrist and walked into my kitchen. That's what started it. The difficulty belongs to the people who think a child is a thing they own, not to you." She looked at me, that still serious look. "You are not Kethani," she said, an echo of the Gray's words, but with an entirely different weight in her voice. "No," I said. "My mother said, she said humans decide things differently. That a human looks at a child and sees a child." "Yes," I said. "Not a vessel," she said. "Never a vessel." She looked at the bead string on her wrist. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have something to show you. I have been thinking about whether to show you. I decided yes." She unwrapped the bead string from her wrist. Not quickly, carefully, the way she did everything, attentive to the knot at each end. She held it out to me. "My mother gave me this," she said. "She told me what it was. She said the reclamancy would want it back. That was why I wasn't supposed to show it to people. But she also said," she paused, organizing the words. "She said that the cord is a document, that it says who I am in their records, that there is a corresponding cord in the reclamancy's archive, a matching pair. That is how lineal holders are registered." I looked at the bead string in her hand. 22 beads, ochre and cream and kiveth green. "If the cord is a document," I said slowly, "then it has a counterpart." "In the archive," she said. "My mother said she took this cord from the reclamancy's custody when she left. She said that if I had both cords I would be unregistered, that the reclamancy could not claim me without both, that the cord is the claim." I stared at her. She was 11 years old, maybe 12, standing in front of me in a refugee station kitchen at mid-afternoon, holding a piece of clay beads on a knotted cord, explaining to me the mechanism of the thing that had been trying to take her for 40 days. "Your mother," I said very carefully, "took the cord from the archive." "Yes, when she ran. She said she had both cords for months before she had to put it on me, that she kept the archive cord hidden. She said she gave me this one when she knew she was dying, because she needed me to know what I was carrying. She said the reclamancy couldn't formally process the custody writ without producing the archive cord to match against." She looked at the bead string. "I have been thinking about the document thing you said. That documents disagree, and we wait for someone to sort out which ones are right. But if one document is missing, if there is a gap in their document, then their claim is incomplete." I sat very still. "Where is the archive cord?" I asked. She reached into the pocket of her worn tunic and set a second bead string on my desk. 22 beads, ochre and cream and kiveth green, in a slightly different arrangement of colors, not identical but paired, the way a key pairs to a lock. My mother put it in the inner lining of the bag she gave me, Orinde said. I found it 2 weeks ago. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if it was the right kind of document. She looked at me steadily. Is it the right kind? I looked at the 2 bead strings on my desk. I thought about Reclamancy Doctrine 44, which I had read 3 times now, which required, for the formal processing of a spiritual custody claim, the presentation of both lineal cords, the holder's cord and the archive cord, to demonstrate that the claim was authenticated. The Gray had never once mentioned the archive cord. He had presented the writ which referenced the lineal holder and the devotional line, but the writ itself was a formal legal demand. It was not the authentication procedure. The authentication procedure was separate, and without the archive cord in the reclamancy's possession, their ability to complete the authentication was compromised. Technically, possibly fatally. Orinde, I said, I need to make some calls. She nodded once, the serious single nod. I'll put the kettle on, she said. You look like you need something warm. She was right, I did. I spent the rest of that afternoon, and most of the night on the communications link, with the consortium's humanitarian legal office, which I had been cultivating for 6 weeks via careful and strategically worded inquiries. I explained the archive cord. I explained what it meant for the authentication procedure. The duty attorney on the other end of the line was initially skeptical, then became increasingly quiet in the way lawyers become quiet when they are reading something very carefully. She told me she would need to verify the Doctrine 44 authentication requirements. I told her I had already translated and annotated the relevant sections and would transmit them immediately. At 4 in the morning, she told me that she believed I had a strong argument that the reclamancy's transfer claim was procedurally incomplete, that without the archive cord, they could not satisfy their own doctrine's authentication requirement, and that this procedural defect would need to be resolved before any transfer could be compelled. She also told me that this would need to be verified by someone with formal standing in Kethani religious law, and that finding such a person might take time. I told her I had someone in mind. Suvesh was the person I had in mind. He had been, before his harbor, a licensed navigator in Kethani territorial space, which required a working knowledge of reclamancy doctrine as it applied to maritime and transit law. He was not a religious legal expert, but he was a Kethani elder, and his statement about the cord's significance would carry more weight than mine. I woke him at 5 in the morning. He sat at my desk and looked at the 2 bead strings for a long time without speaking. Esavith, he said finally, quietly. She planned this, I said, from the beginning. Yes. He touched the archive cord very gently, not picking it up. I did not know she had taken it. I suspected she had done something, the fact that they were following her, the fact that she ran for so long, and yet they never caught her. But I didn't know this. I need your statement, I said, written, on record, about what the cord means and what the authentication requirement is. He nodded slowly. It will not be easy for them to dismiss, he said. A Kethani elder's statement about Kethani doctrine, they will argue it. He looked at me. You know they will argue it. I know, I said. I just need them to be arguing about the cord instead of arguing about Orinde. He looked at me. Then he looked at the kitchen, where Orinde was already on her crate at the prep counter, doing the early morning mise en place for a breakfast service that started in 2 hours, because she had decided that this was useful and she was going to do it. Yes, he said. That is the right thing to argue about. He wrote his statement. It took him most of that morning. He was careful about language in the way that people who have operated under legal frameworks their whole lives are careful, choosing words that would not be easy to reframe or dismiss, building the case from inside the reclamancy's own published doctrine, so that any challenge to the statement would require the reclamancy to challenge its own texts. When he was done, he read it back to himself once in silence. Then he set the pen down. "It is accurate," he said. "Every word of it is accurate. They will know that." "That's what I need," I said. I transmitted it, with the authentication requirement annotations, to the Humanitarian Legal Office, and the Humanitarian Legal Office transmitted it with a formal legal challenge to the reclamancy's transfer writ, citing the procedural defect. The challenge went to the Kethani Territorial Authority. The Kethani Territorial Authority sent it to the reclamancy's administrative office. 3 days later, the Gray came to my kitchen doorway for the last time. He looked different than he had before. Not defeated, exactly. The Gray was not someone who easily showed defeat, but there was a different quality to his stillness, the stillness of someone recalculating. He told me that the reclamancy's administrative office was reviewing the procedural challenge, that pending that review, the transfer writ was suspended, that the reclamancy reserved all rights under the territorial accord. I told him I understood. He looked at me for a long moment. "You are not Kethani," he said. "No. You have no lineage stake, no devotional connection, no community claim. You are a human cook in a transit station kitchen. Why?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Esavith in my doorway. I thought about the knock, that specific knock, the last of what she had left. I thought about 2 steps forward and wide amber eyes and a bowl held in both hands for the warmth before the food. "Because she was standing in my kitchen," I said. "That's enough. For a human, that's enough." He left. He and the second auditor were off the station by the end of the day. The reclamancy's administrative review took 4 months. In the end, they concluded that the absence of the archive cord constituted a procedural defect that rendered the transfer writ unenforceable in its current form, and that refiling would require a full authentication process that could not be completed without the archive cord. The archive cord was in my kitchen, registered as material evidence in the humanitarian legal case. It would remain there for the duration of the proceedings. The Civilian Oversight Committee's response came back in the meantime, and it concluded that reclamancy writs applied with reduced force in shared jurisdiction transit corridors, and that welfare provisions took precedence in cases of ambiguity. The Territorial Authority closed the writ. My guardianship registration renewed, then renewed again. Then, 2 years after I had crouched down in my kitchen doorway to ask a child if she was hungry, the consortium approved permanent custodial status. I remember the morning that notification came through. Oronde was on her crate at the prep counter, doing the vegetable prep for the morning service the way she had been doing it for nearly 2 years. I read the notification twice to make sure I was reading it correctly. Then I walked over and I stood next to her, and I told her what it said. She set down the knife. She looked at the counter. She was quiet for long enough that I began to wonder if I should say something else, if there was something more to say, if the words had landed right. Then she reached over and put her hand on my forearm. Small hand, not squeezing, just resting there. "Thank you," she said, "for the paperwork." I told her she was welcome. She picked up the knife and went back to the prep. "I want to tell you that I did something clever or brave. I want to give you a story with a moment of pure courage in it, a line where I stood between the child and the threat and refused to move, and that was the thing that mattered. Maybe what I did was that. Maybe standing at a prep counter filing the same type of inquiry for the 14th time, at 4 in the morning, when the reclamancy's clock was running, and the legal office's responses were getting shorter, and the Gray was standing in my doorway telling me it ends one way. Maybe that is a kind of courage. The held position. The refusal to concede ground to someone who has more institutional weight than you and is counting on you to feel how much more. Maybe the quiet no is as real as the loud one. I don't know. I'm a cook and a logistics coordinator, and I have bad knees, and I am not prone to thinking of myself in those terms. But the thing that mattered was a girl who had paid enough attention to understand that she was carrying two halves of the same document. A girl whose mother had run for 11 months through a transit queue, who had understood that the cord was the claim, who had put both cords in her daughter's hands, because she trusted that someday there would be someone who would know what to do with the right kind of document. Orinde found it. Orinde understood it. Orinde put it on my desk and said, "Is this the right kind?" I was the one who knew what to do with it. That's true. But she was the one who saved us both, and I want that to be clear. She is 23 now. She left Sarath 6 at 17 to study transit corridor law at the consortium's academic facility on Veth Prime, which was, she told me with the particular careful understatement she has never quite lost, a field she thought she might have some relevant experience in. She qualified last year. She works in the Civilian Oversight Division of the Transit Corridor Compact. She sends me correspondence every month. Not messages, correspondence, proper and formal, the way she learned to value documents, which is to say deeply and precisely, and with attention to what they actually say versus what they're supposed to say. The last one arrived 3 weeks ago. It informed me that she had successfully argued for an amendment to the Transit Corridor Compact's child welfare provisions, expanding the definition of established living situation to explicitly include informal care arrangements formed in humanitarian settings. The amendment passed by committee vote. She included a footnote. It said, "Relevant precedent, Waystation Sarath 6, guardianship matter of 1 Orinde, resolved in the affirmative. Thank you for the paperwork." I read it at my desk in the kitchen. A different kitchen now, a bigger station further rimward, though the smell of industrial solvent under the cooking smell is exactly the same, and I held it for a while. Outside, the service staff was running the morning mise en place. The burners were up. The ventilation current was moving. Somewhere in the prep area, one of the younger Kethani staff members was humming, the sound of running water at low volume, the sound of someone at peace in a familiar place. I set the correspondence down. I put the kettle on. Some debts are settled quietly. In a kitchen, at a prep counter, in the shape of work that continues and children who grow up and come back with better papers than the ones that tried to take them. That is enough. For a human, that is always enough.